The ground under my feet was shaking before the sound even reached us. I remember that most clearly, even now. The shaking came first, like the moon itself was afraid. And then a heartbeat later the roar followed, rolling across the broken hills of Krathis 9, like something enormous had woken up angry. I am Vex Ordan, a trooper of the Coalition Defense Corps, and I was running. We all were, 6 of us, what was left of a 9-person unit, sprinting across cracked stone under a sky the color of rust, dragging gear that suddenly felt too heavy and too loud. Behind us, the checkpoint we had been holding for 11 hours was falling apart piece by piece, support beams folding like wet paper, dust rising in thick curtains that caught the dying light and turned it orange. Sergeant Holt was in front, moving with the kind of grim focus that told me he had already made a decision none of us were going to like. Owen Bright was beside me, breathing hard, his rifle held wrong because his hand would not stop shaking. Grace Sutton and Marcus Kell were a few steps behind, half carrying, half dragging a supply case between them, because neither one trusted the other to keep it upright alone. Nina Kellaway brought up the rear, walking backward every few steps to check the way we had come, her eyes wide and her jaw tight. And behind all of us, back at the checkpoint, in the ruins of the second bunker, lay Corporal Daniel Hale. He was the only human in our unit. The Coalition Defense Corps did not have many humans in it back then, not this far out, and Hale had been assigned to us 3 months earlier as part of an exchange program nobody had explained very well. He was quiet most of the time, the kind of quiet that made you forget he was in the room until he said something that made you rethink everything you thought you understood. He laughed at our jokes even when he did not understand them. He learned 3 words of my language in the first week just so he could greet me properly in the mornings. An hour ago, a support strut had come down on his legs during the second wave of the attack. I had seen it happen. I had seen him go down hard, dust and debris swallowing him whole, and I had heard him call out, not in pain exactly, but in surprise, the way you call out when the world suddenly does something you did not expect it to do. We had gone to him. I want that understood, even now, even knowing what came after. We had gone to him first. Sergeant Holt had knelt beside the strut and tried to shift it, and it had not moved, not even a little, and the wall above us had groaned in a way that meant it was thinking about coming down too. Marcus had pulled at the debris with both hands until his gloves tore. Nina had screamed into her comm for a medevac that was never coming because the extraction ships had already been recalled 20 minutes earlier, pulled off the moon by an order none of us had been told about until it was too late to matter. Hale had looked up at us from the dust and the dark, his face streaked with blood that was not all his own, and he had said something I will never forget. He had said, calmly, like he was discussing the weather, that we needed to go. Sergeant Holt had frozen. I remember that. I remember the exact shape of his hesitation, the way his mouth opened and nothing came out for 3 full seconds. Hale had said it again, go. He had said the wall would not hold much longer, and that if we stayed, we would all die trying to save one person who could not be saved in time, and that the math of it was simple, even if none of us wanted to say it out loud. I want to tell you that I argued, that I grabbed the strut myself and refused to let go until my hands bled, that I was the one voice in that collapsing room who said no, we are not doing this, we are not leaving a person behind, because the math is inconvenient. I did not do that. None of us did. The wall groaned again, louder this time, and somewhere above us something structural gave way, with a crack that sounded like the moon itself breaking in half, and Sergeant Holt made the call. He said Hale's name once, quietly, almost like an apology, and then he turned and started moving, and the rest of us followed, because that is what you do when the person in charge decides the conversation is over. I looked back once. I saw Hale watching us go, his face unreadable in the dust and the failing light, and then the doorway filled with smoke, and I could not see him anymore, and we were running, and the checkpoint was falling apart behind us, and somewhere in that noise and that dust, a man we had trained beside for 3 months was being left to whatever was coming next. We told ourselves things after. I remember exactly what we told ourselves, because I told myself the same things over and over, like a prayer. We told ourselves the wall had probably already come down, and if it had, then it was already over, and nothing we could have done would have changed the outcome. We told ourselves the enemy forces sweeping the ridge would be focused on the checkpoint's remaining defenses, and not on a wounded man buried under debris. We told ourselves that grief later was better than 5 more deaths now, that the mission still had value, that Sergeant Holt had made the only decision a rational commander could make under the circumstances. We told ourselves a lot of things in that first hour, moving fast through broken terrain under a sky full of smoke, and every single one of those things was a way of not saying the true thing, which was that we had left him there, alive, and we had not gone back. The land past the checkpoint dropped into a shallow valley thick with dark, twisted trees that the survey maps called the Calvo Reach, and Sergeant Holt led us into the tree line because it was the only cover for kilometers in any direction. The moment we crossed under the first branches, the temperature dropped, and the noise of the battle behind us faded into something distant and unreal, like a storm you can see from very far away. For a while, nobody spoke. We just walked, boots crunching on dry undergrowth, weapons up, eyes moving. I kept glancing at Owen beside me, and I could see him doing the math too, the same math I was doing, turning it over and over like a stone in his pocket. Grace and Marcus had stopped talking to each other entirely, which was unusual, because normally they argued about everything, the weight distribution of gear, the fastest route, whose turn it was to carry the heavy pack. Now there was only silence between them, heavy and complicated. Nina was the one who finally said it. She said his name. Just that. Hale. She said it quietly, almost like she was testing whether the word would still make sense out here, away from the fire and the collapsing walls, and none of us answered her, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. Sergeant Holt called a short halt near a rock formation that gave us cover on 3 sides, and we crouched low, catching our breath, checking our gear, doing the small necessary tasks that keep a person from thinking too hard about the larger ones. I checked my rifle. I checked my supply pouch. I checked the direction indicator on my wrist unit, watching the little arrow spin and settle toward the extraction point, still 6 kilometers away through unfamiliar terrain. That was when I first heard it. It was faint, so faint I almost dismissed it as my own pulse in my ears. A soft, rhythmic sound, somewhere off to our left, moving parallel to us through the trees, not fast, not urgent, just steady, patient, matching our pace almost exactly. I did not say anything at first. I told myself it was an animal, some native creature of Krathis 9, disturbed by the fighting and moving away from the noise, just like us. I told myself that because it was easier than the alternative, and because Sergeant Holt had already given the signal to move again, and questioning every sound in an unfamiliar forest was not something a disciplined trooper did without good reason, we started walking again, and the sound came with us. It stayed with us for the better part of an hour, always at the same distance, always on the same side, never closing, never falling back. Every time I turned my head to look, there was nothing there but trees and shadow, and the deepening dark of a Krathis 9 evening, settling in around us like a held breath. Owen noticed it too. I could tell by the way his eyes kept flicking left, the same rhythm as mine, the two of us performing the same private ritual of pretending not to notice something we could not stop noticing. Eventually he leaned toward me and asked, very quietly, if I was hearing what he was hearing. I said I was. He asked what I thought it was. I did not have an answer for him. I still do not really, not one that makes the rest of what happened feel any less strange. I told him it was probably wildlife, and he nodded like he wanted to believe that, and neither of us said anything more about it, because saying more about it would have meant admitting how much it had already gotten under our skin. The forest thickened as we went, the trees growing closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained in the sky. Sergeant Holt slowed the pace, using a handheld scanner to check for structural hazards and hostile signatures, sweeping it left and right in careful arcs. The scanner showed nothing, no heat signatures beyond our own, no motion beyond the wind moving through branches. According to every instrument we carried, we were alone out here, but the sound did not stop. If anything, it grew more deliberate as the light faded, as if whatever was making it no longer needed to be careful about staying hidden, only careful about staying close. I found myself counting my own steps just to have something steady to hold on to, a rhythm that belonged entirely to me, separate from the rhythm moving through the trees to our left. Grace was the one who finally raised it with Sergeant Holt directly. She stopped walking, lifted her rifle slightly, and asked him if he was hearing the same thing the rest of us were hearing. Sergeant Holt paused. For a long moment he simply stood there, head tilted, listening. I watched his face carefully, looking for some sign of the calm certainty he usually carried, and I did not find it. What I found instead was the same uncertainty the rest of us were feeling, carefully hidden, but not hidden well enough. He said it was probably local wildlife, the same thing I had told Owen, and I understood in that moment that he did not believe it any more than I did. He said it because a leader has to say something, and silence in front of a frightened unit is its own kind of danger. We kept moving. The sound kept moving with us. An hour later, Marcus asked to fall back slightly to reposition the supply case, saying the weight had shifted and was pulling at his shoulder. Sergeant Holt allowed it, telling him to keep visual contact and rejoin the group within 2 minutes. Marcus nodded, slowed his pace, and let the rest of us move a short distance ahead while he adjusted the straps. 2 minutes became 3, 3 became 5. Nina was the first to notice he had not caught up. She turned, scanning the trees behind us, and called his name once, quietly, the way you call out when you do not yet want to admit that something is wrong. There was no answer. Sergeant Holt called the halt immediately, and we retraced our steps, weapons ready, moving in a tight formation back toward the last place any of us remembered seeing Marcus. The forest around us had gone completely silent. Even the steady pacing sound from earlier had stopped, and somehow that silence was worse than the sound had ever been. We found the supply case first, sitting upright against a tree exactly where he must have set it down. A few meters beyond it, we found his rifle, lying in the undergrowth, untouched, unfired. There was a mark on the ground nearby, a long scorched line pressed into the dirt and dead leaves, precise and clean, the kind of mark that did not look like it belonged to any weapon or accident I had ever seen. There was no blood. There was no sign of a struggle. There was simply Marcus's rifle, and his supply case, and an empty stretch of forest where a person should have been standing. We called his name for nearly 10 minutes. Sergeant Holt used every scanning function his equipment had to offer, sweeping wide circles around our position, searching for any heat signature, any trace, any sign of what had happened. The scanner found nothing. According to every instrument we carried, Marcus Kell had simply stopped existing. I remember standing there in the deepening dark, my rifle raised toward trees that gave back nothing but shadow, and thinking that whatever had taken Marcus had done it without a single one of us hearing so much as a struggle. It had happened in complete silence, within calling distance of 5 armed troopers, and none of us had noticed until it was already finished. Grace would not stop staring at the scorch mark on the ground. She kept crouching beside it, running her fingers just above the surface without touching it, as though trying to read something in the pattern of the burn. When Sergeant Holt finally called us to move, she stood slowly, and I saw something in her face that had not been there before. Not just fear. Understanding maybe, or the beginning of it, the first cold edge of a thought none of us wanted to finish. We moved on, because staying was not an option, not in unfamiliar terrain with light failing, and an unknown threat somewhere among the trees. But we moved differently now. Closer together, slower. Every sound behind us made all 5 of us turn at once, weapons raised, hearts hammering against nothing but shadow and wind. Somewhere behind us, I told myself, was the checkpoint, and whatever remained of it, and whatever remained of Daniel Hale. I did not say his name out loud. None of us did, not for the rest of that night. But I think all of us were thinking it, turning it over the same way Grace had turned over the scorch mark on the ground, looking for some pattern, some explanation, some way to make sense of what was happening to us in the dark. We had left him behind because the math seemed simple. Now the forest itself seemed to be doing math of its own, 1 trooper at a time, and none of us understood the equation yet. The night deepened around us, and somewhere in the trees, patient and unseen, something continued to watch us go. None of us slept that night, not really. Sergeant Holt called a stop near a cluster of boulders that offered cover from 3 directions, and we took turns keeping watch in pairs, though watching for what, exactly, none of us could say with any confidence. The forest of Kratis 9 had a way of swallowing sound entirely one moment and throwing it back at you the next, distorted and strange, so that every snap of a branch could have been footsteps, or wind, or nothing at all. I sat with Owen during the second watch, both of us facing outward into the dark, with our backs against cold stone. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There did not seem to be much point in speaking. Every question either of us might have asked led back to the same place, and none of us wanted to arrive there again so soon after leaving. Eventually Owen broke the silence anyway. He asked if I thought Marcus was still alive. I told him I did not know. It was the truth. I had turned the question over in my mind more times than I could count, and every answer I arrived at felt like a guess dressed up as certainty. The scorch mark had not looked like the aftermath of an execution. It had looked deliberate in a different way, almost surgical, the kind of mark left by something that knew exactly what it was doing and had done it without waste or hesitation. Owen said that scared him more than the alternative. He said if Marcus was dead, at least that was an ending, something with a shape he could understand. But if Marcus was alive, taken somewhere, held somewhere, then the not knowing would just keep stretching out in front of us, and he did not know how much of that he could carry. I did not have an answer for him. I put a hand on his shoulder instead, and we sat like that for a while, listening to the forest breathe around us, waiting for morning. When the first grey light finally broke through the canopy, Sergeant Holt gathered us to plan the day's route. He had marked a new path on his map display, one that avoided the densest part of the forest, and cut instead along a ridge that would eventually rejoin the extraction corridor. It added distance to our journey, but it also kept us in more open terrain, where at least we would have a better chance of seeing anything before it got too close. Nobody argued with the plan. Nobody had the energy to argue with anything anymore. We ate in near silence, cold rations that none of us really tasted, and then we shouldered our packs and began walking again, the 4 of us, now instead of the 6 who had left the checkpoint, and the memory of a 5th, who was no longer with us either, still back there somewhere among the ruins. Grace walked beside me for a while that morning, and I could tell she wanted to say something. She kept starting sentences and stopping them, her jaw working like she was chewing on words she was not sure she should say out loud. Finally, somewhere around midday, she asked me directly whether I thought what had taken Marcus was the same thing that had been following us the evening before, the thing whose footsteps we had all pretended not to hear. I told her I thought it probably was. There was no good reason to believe 2 separate threats were operating in the same stretch of forest on the same night, moving with the same patience, and I said as much. Grace nodded slowly, like she had already arrived at the same conclusion and had simply needed someone else to say it first. Then she asked the question none of us had asked yet, the one that had been sitting underneath everything since the moment we found that empty stretch of ground where Marcus should have been standing. She asked if I thought it could be human. I remember the way that question landed, the way it seemed to change the air around us even though nothing physical had happened at all. I told her that did not make sense. Hale had been wounded, trapped, buried under a support strut we had all seen come down with our own eyes. Even if he had somehow survived the collapse, even if he had somehow freed himself from the wreckage, he would have been alone, injured, without support, moving through hostile terrain on a moon he barely knew. Grace said that was exactly her point. She said none of that sounded like something that should be possible, and yet here we were, being followed by something we could not identify, something that had taken one of our own without leaving so much as a struggle behind. I told her I did not want to believe it. That was honest at least. Whatever guilt I was carrying about the checkpoint, about the decision none of us had argued against, I did not want it compounded by the idea that the man we left behind might now be somewhere out there in the dark, watching us the same patient way that presence in the trees had watched us the night before. We did not speak of it again for the rest of the morning, but I noticed the way Grace kept glancing sideways into the tree line after that, and I understood she was looking for the same thing I was now looking for too, a shape, a shadow, some confirmation or denial of the thought she had put into words. By early afternoon, the ridge Sergeant Holt had planned our route around began to narrow, forcing us into a single file along a rocky path with a steep drop on one side and dense tree line on the other. It was not an ideal position, and Sergeant Holt knew it as well as any of us, but the alternative routes on his map all added hours we did not have if we wanted to reach the extraction corridor before nightfall again. Nina took point, her rifle steady, her pace careful and measured. I fell in behind her, then Owen, then Grace, with Sergeant Holt bringing up the rear where he could keep the widest possible view of the path behind us. We had been walking the ridge for perhaps 20 minutes when Nina stopped abruptly, one fist raised, the signal for immediate silence. All of us froze in place, weapons rising in near unison, eyes scanning the tree line to our right, where the path curved out of sight ahead. For a long moment, nothing happened. Wind moved through the branches. Somewhere far below, water ran over rock in a distant stream we could hear but not see. Then, faint but unmistakable, we heard it again, the same steady, patient rhythm from the night before, moving somewhere in the trees just beyond our line of sight, matching our position almost exactly. Nina lowered her raised fist slowly and glanced back at Sergeant Holt, waiting for direction. He studied the tree line for a long moment, then gave the signal to continue moving, but slower now, weapons ready, every one of us hyper-aware of the narrow drop to our left and the dense cover to our right that could have hidden anything at all. We walked like that for what felt like an hour, though it was probably closer to 20 minutes, the sound trailing us the entire time, never closing the distance, never falling behind, simply present, a constant reminder that we were not as alone out here as the empty ridge might have suggested. It was Owen who broke first. I do not say that as an accusation. I say it because it is the truth, and because I understood exactly why he did it, having felt the same pressure building in my own chest the entire time we walked that narrow path, with something patient and unseen tracking our every step. He stopped walking. He turned toward the tree line, rifle raised, and called out into the trees, demanding whoever or whatever was following us show itself. His voice cracked on the last word. I remember that clearly, the way exhaustion and fear had worn down even the simple mechanics of speech. For a moment, the forest went utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees, we heard something that none of us had expected. A voice, low and rough, carried faintly on the wind, too distant and too broken by distance to make out clear words, but unmistakably a voice, and unmistakably shaped by grief and something colder underneath it. Sergeant Holt grabbed Owen by the shoulder and pulled him back into formation, hissing at him to stay quiet, to keep moving. That calling out to an unknown threat in unfamiliar terrain was exactly the kind of mistake that got people killed. Owen did not argue. He simply lowered his rifle, his face pale, and fell back into line. None of us spoke about the voice for the rest of the day, but I saw the way Grace's hand tightened around her rifle. I saw the way Nina kept glancing back over her shoulder every few steps instead of just watching the path ahead, and I felt, more than heard, the way that single word Grace had spoken that morning settled over the entire group like a weight none of us could set down. Human. We reached a shallow cave system as the light began to fail again, a series of connected hollows carved into the ridge by centuries of wind and water, offering better shelter than the open boulders we had used the night before. Sergeant Holt decided we would hold here rather than risk moving through unfamiliar terrain after dark, and none of us objected. The idea of walking through another night with that presence trailing us through unbroken darkness was more than any of us wanted to consider. We set up a rotating watch again, and I found myself paired with Nina for the first shift, the two of us sitting near the cave entrance with a clear view of the ridge path in both directions. Nina was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the darkening tree line. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper, as though she was afraid of being overheard by something more than just her own squad. She asked me if I remembered the sound Hale's voice used to make when he laughed. She said it had a particular rhythm to it, a kind of warmth that did not quite match his usual quiet demeanor, and she said she had been trying all day to compare that sound to the voice we heard on the ridge, trying to decide if they could possibly be the same person. I told her I did not know. I told her the distance and the wind had distorted the voice too much to be certain of anything, and that was true, but it was also, I think, another way of avoiding the same conclusion Grace had already spoken out loud that morning. Nina nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer for what it was. Then she said something that stayed with me for the rest of that long, sleepless night. She said that if it really was Hale out there, then what we had done to him mattered more than any of us wanted to admit, because whatever was tracking us through this forest was not moving like something confused or lost. It was moving like something with a purpose, patient and deliberate, choosing exactly when to close the distance and exactly when to hold back. She said that kind of patience did not belong to an animal, and it did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone who knew us, someone who had walked beside us for 3 months, learned our routines, memorized our formations, understood exactly how we moved through unfamiliar terrain, and exactly how long it would take before exhaustion and fear started working against us instead of for us. I did not sleep much after that conversation. I lay awake in the shallow cave, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside, and I thought about the strut that had come down on Hale's legs, and the wall that had groaned above us, and the moment Sergeant Holt had said his name once, quietly, almost like an apology, before turning to leave him behind. I thought about the empty stretch of ground where Marcus should have been standing, and the scorch mark pressed into the dirt with such precision that it looked almost intentional, almost like a message left for whoever came looking. Somewhere out in that dark forest, something patient and purposeful was moving among the trees, closing the distance one careful step at a time, and for the first time since the checkpoint had collapsed behind us, I found myself wondering if the greatest danger we faced on Krathis 9 was never the enemy we had been fighting at all. Maybe it was the promise we had broken, walking back toward us, through the dark, one silent footstep at a time. Morning came slowly, gray light seeping into the cave, in thin, hesitant layers, and none of us moved to greet it with any real relief. Sleep, when it came at all during the last watch rotations, had been shallow and broken, the kind of rest that leaves a person more tired than if they had stayed awake entirely. Sergeant Holt was the first to stand, stretching stiff shoulders, checking his equipment with the same careful ritual he performed every morning regardless of circumstance. I think that ritual was the only thing holding some of us together at that point, the simple comfort of routine in a situation that had stopped making sense somewhere around the moment we found Marcus's rifle lying untouched in the undergrowth. We ate quickly, checked our gear, and prepared to move. Nobody mentioned the voice from the ridge. Nobody mentioned the conversation Nina and I had shared during the night. But I could see it sitting behind everyone's eyes, the same unspoken thought we were all carrying now, heavier with every kilometer we put between ourselves and the checkpoint. It was Grace who finally gave that thought a place to live, somewhere around mid-morning, when the path widened enough for us to walk 2 abreast instead of single file. She fell into step beside me and asked, without any preamble, whether I had ever heard the stories. I asked her which stories she meant, though I think I already understood. She meant the stories about human soldiers, the ones the coalition training programs mentioned only in passing, footnotes in briefings that seemed designed to be forgotten rather than remembered. Stories about how humans approached the concept of leaving someone behind, how deeply that idea seemed to violate something fundamental in how their species organized loyalty and duty. I told her I had heard fragments of it, mostly rumor, mostly the kind of thing traded between troopers during long transport flights when there was nothing else to do but talk. I had never taken it particularly seriously. Every species has its own mythology about itself, stories exaggerated through repetition until they become something closer to legend than fact. Grace said she used to think the same thing, but she said she had a cousin who served alongside a human unit during the border conflicts 2 years earlier, and her cousin had told her something that stuck with her ever since. Her cousin said that human commanders treated the phrase, "leave no one behind," not as a strategic guideline to be weighed against circumstances, but as something closer to an absolute law, woven so deeply into how they trained and fought that violating it was treated almost like violating a fundamental law of physics. She said her cousin had described watching a human extraction team turn back into active combat, twice, under heavy resistance, specifically to recover the body of a soldier who had already been confirmed dead, because leaving that body behind was considered unacceptable even when there was no possibility of saving a life. I remember feeling a chill at that, one that had nothing to do with the morning air. I asked her why that mattered now, though I think I already knew the answer she was going to give. She said that if that kind of loyalty ran that deep in how humans were raised and trained, then abandoning one of their own, even under justified circumstances, even when survival math seemed to demand it, might not register to a human the same way it would register to the rest of us. It might not be processed as a difficult, regrettable, necessary choice. It might be processed as something closer to a fundamental betrayal, the kind that does not simply fade with time or context. Nina, walking just ahead of us, had clearly been listening, because she turned partway around and added her own piece to the conversation. She said her training instructor once told her that human military doctrine placed extraordinary weight on trust between soldiers precisely because their species had a long history of surviving through cooperation rather than individual strength. She said the instructor had explained it almost like a warning, saying that if you ever fought alongside human forces, you needed to understand that trust, once broken, was not something they forgave easily, and that some human units had reputations for holding grudges across entire campaigns when they felt that trust had been violated by an ally. Owen, walking a few steps behind us, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like an exhale of disbelief. He said all of this made Hale sound less like a person and more like something out of a campfire story meant to frighten new recruits. Grace did not answer him directly. She just looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression made Owen's half-smile fade away entirely. Sergeant Holt, who had been quiet through most of this exchange, finally spoke up from where he walked a short distance ahead. He said that regardless of what any of us believed about human psychology or human mythology, we needed to stay focused on the practical reality of our situation. We had lost one member of our unit under circumstances none of us fully understood. We were being tracked by something we had not yet identified with certainty. Speculation about motive was less important right now than survival. It was a reasonable thing to say. It was also, I noticed, the kind of thing a person says when they do not want to consider the alternative too closely, because considering it means admitting a level of responsibility that is much harder to carry than simple bad luck. We walked in silence again after that, the conversation settling into the same uneasy quiet that had characterized most of our journey since the checkpoint. But I noticed something had shifted in how we moved as a group. Before, we had been listening for sounds, watching the tree line out of practical necessity, the standard vigilance of troopers moving through unfamiliar terrain. Now, we were listening for something specific, waiting for a particular kind of silence to break, a particular kind of shape to emerge from between the trees. The abstract threat of the night before had taken on a name, even if none of us had spoken that name out loud, since Grace first raised the question. And a named threat is always more terrifying than an unnamed one, because a named threat comes with a face, a history, a reason. Around midday, we stopped near a shallow stream to refill our water supplies and rest briefly before continuing. It was the first real break we had allowed ourselves since setting out that morning, and for a few minutes, the ordinary business of filtering water and checking supplies gave us all something to focus on, besides the growing weight pressing down on the group. I found myself sitting near Nina again, while the others worked, and I asked her something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since our conversation the night before. I asked her whether she thought, if this really was Hale, if he intended to harm us. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering. She said she did not think harm was the right word for what was happening. She pointed out that Marcus had disappeared without any sign of struggle, without any blood, without any indication of violence at the moment of his taking. She said whoever or whatever had done this had shown a remarkable degree of control and precision. She said that if this really was someone seeking harm in the way we usually understood the word, Marcus's disappearance would likely have looked very different, and probably several of the rest of us would already be gone as well, given how many opportunities the presence in the trees had already had to close the distance on an exhausted, poorly rested unit. Instead, she said, it felt more like something else, something closer to a lesson being delivered slowly, piece by piece, designed to make each of us understand exactly what had been done and exactly what it had cost, before whatever final reckoning was still waiting for us at the end of this journey. But I did not find much comfort in that theory, but I understood why she believed it, because it matched the pattern we had all been watching unfold since the moment we crossed into the tree line of the Calvo Reach. Patient, deliberate, precise. Nothing about it resembled a wild attack driven by anger or desperation. It resembled discipline, and discipline, more than anything else, was the quality that had defined Daniel Hale from the very first day he joined our unit. Sergeant Holt called us back into formation before the conversation could continue further, and we resumed our march along the ridge path, the afternoon sun climbing higher and doing little to warm the cold, unsettled feeling that had settled over all of us since the night before. It was during that afternoon stretch that Owen finally asked the question none of us had wanted to voice directly. He asked whether we should try to make contact, to call out again, to attempt some kind of communication, rather than simply running and waiting to see what happened next. Sergeant Holt considered the question seriously before answering. He said that if this really was Hale, and if Hale intended to speak with us rather than simply continue this slow campaign of silent pursuit, then he would make that choice himself, on his own terms and in his own time. He said that trying to force contact with an unknown threat, in unfamiliar terrain, with limited resources and an already reduced unit, was exactly the kind of risk none of us could afford to take. Whatever was following us clearly had the advantage of terrain knowledge, patience, and the element of surprise. Rushing toward that advantage rather than away from it would only make our situation worse. It was, again, a reasonable position. But I noticed the way Owen's shoulders sagged slightly at the answer, the way Grace's eyes drifted back toward the tree line, with something that looked almost like longing, as though some part of her wanted this waiting to end, wanted whatever confrontation was coming to simply arrive, rather than continuing to loom just out of sight with every step we took. As the day wore on, the terrain began to change again, the ridge path descending gradually into a wider valley, dotted with rock formations and sparse clusters of trees, offering less cover than the dense forest behind us, but also fewer places for something to hide unseen. Sergeant Holt seemed to relax slightly as we moved into the more open terrain, and I understood why. Open ground meant visibility, and visibility meant at least a chance to see danger coming before it arrived. But the sound found us again anyway, near dusk, drifting across the open valley from somewhere behind the rock formations to our right. The same steady, patient rhythm, the same unhurried pace, matching ours almost exactly, as though whatever moved through those rocks had never lost track of us at all, open terrain or dense forest, making no real difference to its ability to follow. We made camp that night in a shallow depression between two large boulders, the most defensible position the open valley offered, and Sergeant Holt organized watch rotations, with visible tension in his voice, the calm authority of the past 2 days beginning to fray at the edges. I took the first watch again, this time with Grace beside me, both of us staring out into the darkening valley where the sound had come from earlier. Grace did not speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was quiet, almost fragile, in a way I had not heard from her before. She said she kept thinking about the moment we left the checkpoint, replaying it over and over, trying to find some other choice we could have made, some alternative path that did not end with Hale buried under debris while the rest of us disappeared into the trees. She said she could not find one. Every version of that moment she replayed ended the same way, with the wall groaning above them, with time running out, with a decision that had to be made in seconds, rather than the careful deliberation it deserved. She said that was the part that frightened her the most, not that we had made the wrong choice necessarily, but that even now, even with everything that had happened since, she still was not certain there had been a better one available to us in that moment. I told her I understood exactly what she meant, because I had been running the same replay in my own mind since the moment we crossed into the tree line, and I had arrived at the same uncertain conclusion every single time. We sat together in silence after that, watching the dark valley for any sign of movement, listening for footsteps that did not come, waiting for a confrontation that both of us now understood. On some level neither of us wanted to say out loud, was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of when. The valley gave way to broken hills as we pressed on the next day, and with every kilometer, the mood within the group grew heavier, more brittle, like a rope stretched close to its limit. Sergeant Holt kept the pace steady, refusing to let exhaustion slow us down, but I could see the toll the last 2 days had taken on him. His usual confidence had thinned into something closer to stubbornness, a refusal to acknowledge what the rest of us had already accepted as likely truth. We had gone perhaps 3 kilometers past our overnight position, when Nina stopped walking so suddenly that Owen nearly collided with her from behind. She was staring at something on the ground, her face pale even in the dim morning light. I moved up beside her and saw what had stopped her. A single boot print, pressed clearly into a patch of soft earth beside the trail, far too large and too distinctly shaped to belong to any of us. The tread pattern matched standard human field boots, a design none of the rest of us wore, since our own equipment followed entirely different manufacturing standards. Nobody said anything for a long moment. We simply stood there looking down at that print, at the undeniable physical evidence that something, or someone, wearing human equipment had passed this exact spot recently enough for the print to remain sharp and unweathered. Sergeant Holt crouched down beside it, studying the print with the same careful attention he gave every piece of tactical information, and when he finally stood again, his face had lost some of its color. He said we needed to keep moving. He did not offer any theory about the print, did not speculate about what it meant, simply repeated the order to continue toward the extraction corridor, his voice carrying a hard edge that discouraged further discussion. We walked on, but something had changed in the group's collective posture. Before, we had been running from an unknown threat, something abstract and unidentified in the dark. Now we were running from a threat with a shape, a boot print, a physical presence that had walked this exact ground before us and would likely walk it again behind us. It was Owen who disappeared next. I have replayed the sequence of events so many times since that day, trying to identify the exact moment where things went wrong, and I still cannot find it. We were moving through a narrow pass between 2 rock formations, the group spread in a loose line, Owen, walking perhaps 10 meters behind me, checking our rear, the way Sergeant Holt had assigned him to do. I heard nothing, no struggle, no cry, no sound at all beyond the wind moving between the rocks and the steady rhythm of our own footsteps. It was Nina who noticed first, turning to check the group's spacing out of habit, and finding the space where Owen should have been standing entirely empty. We stopped immediately, weapons raised, and called his name into the rocks surrounding us, our voices echoing back with no response beyond their own fading repetition. Sergeant Holt organized a careful search of the immediate area, and within a few minutes we found his rifle, propped carefully against a rock, exactly the way a person sets something down deliberately rather than dropping it in panic. There was no scorch mark this time, no sign of struggle, just the rifle, resting where he had left it, and Owen nowhere to be found. Grace's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her own weapon steady. She kept turning in slow circles, scanning the rocks above us, the narrow pass ahead and behind, searching for any sign of movement, any confirmation that something was still nearby. Sergeant Holt's composure finally cracked in a way I had not seen from him since this ordeal began. He shouted into the surrounding rocks, demanding whoever was responsible show themselves immediately, his voice carrying a raw edge of anger and fear that none of us had heard from him before. For a long moment, nothing answered. Then, from somewhere above us, on a rocky outcropping overlooking the narrow pass, a voice spoke, clear this time, close enough that distance and wind could no longer distort or disguise it. It said only 3 words, calm and measured, carrying easily across the still morning air. He is safe. I recognized the voice immediately, and from the way Nina's breath caught beside me, I understood she recognized it too. It belonged to Daniel Hale, unmistakably, carrying the same measured, quiet quality it always had, though something in the tone beneath it had changed into something colder, something more deliberate than the warmth I remembered from 3 months of shared meals and shared watches. Sergeant Holt raised his rifle toward the outcropping, though there was nothing visible to aim at, the rocky shelf empty as far as any of us could see. He demanded Hale show himself, demanded an explanation, his voice cracking slightly on the last word, despite his obvious effort to maintain command presence. There was no immediate response. The silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder if we had imagined the voice entirely, some collective hallucination born from exhaustion and fear. Then the voice spoke again, quieter this time, almost thoughtful. It said that we would understand everything soon enough, and that patience would serve us better than fear. After that, nothing. No further sound from the outcropping, no sign of movement, no indication that anyone had ever been there at all, beyond the words still hanging in the cold morning air. Sergeant Holt lowered his rifle slowly, his hands visibly unsteady despite his obvious effort to project calm. He ordered us to continue moving, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and something that might have been the beginning of genuine fear. Grace refused at first. She stood her ground, insisting we needed to search for Owen properly, that we could not simply leave another member of the unit behind without at least attempting to locate him. The irony of her words seemed to land on all of us at exactly the same moment, and I watched her face change as she heard herself say it, understood the weight of what she was asking in the context of everything that had brought us to this moment. Sergeant Holt's expression softened slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less command and more something closer to exhausted honesty. He said that if Hale wanted us to know Owen was safe, then perhaps that was true, and perhaps the safest thing any of us could do right now was continue toward the extraction corridor rather than searching blindly through unfamiliar terrain for someone who might already be beyond our ability to help. He said it quietly, almost gently, and I understood that he was not simply giving an order. He was trying to offer grace, and the rest of us, a version of comfort in a situation that offered very little of it. We moved on, though none of us moved with any real conviction, each step carrying the weight of everything we had left behind in that narrow pass between the rocks. The rest of that day passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread. We did not hear the presence following us again, though its absence felt somehow worse than its earlier constant company, as though the silence itself was a kind of waiting, a held breath before something inevitable arrived. Nina walked close beside me for most of the afternoon, and somewhere in the quiet hours between midday and dusk, she finally said the thing I think all of us had been circling for 2 days without quite landing on it directly. She said that whatever was happening to us was not random, and it was not simple revenge either, not in the way we usually understood that word. She pointed out that if Hale had wanted to harm us outright, he had already had multiple clear opportunities to do so, moments where any one of us had been isolated, vulnerable, and completely unaware of danger closing in. Instead, she said, he seemed to be doing something else entirely, removing us one at a time, carefully, without violence, almost like he was assembling something, building toward a moment he had not yet chosen to reveal. I asked her what she thought that moment would look like when it finally arrived. She did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost resigned. She said she thought it would look like a reckoning. Not punishment exactly, not in the way that word usually implied violence or retribution, but something closer to an accounting, a moment where all of us would be made to understand, completely and without any possibility of denial, exactly what our decision at the checkpoint had cost. I did not have a response to that. I simply walked beside her in silence, watching the hills grow long shadows as the sun began its slow descent, and wondering how many more of us would remain by the time whatever was coming finally chose to arrive. Sergeant Holt found a defensible position as darkness approached, a narrow cleft between 2 large stone formations that offered protection on most sides, while leaving a single approach that could be watched and defended if necessary. He organized the watch rotations with unusual care, his voice tighter than I had ever heard it, and I understood that whatever confidence he had carried into this situation had finally begun to fail him completely. Grace and I took the first watch together, sitting at the narrow entrance to our shelter, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the darkening landscape beyond. She did not speak much during those first hours, and I did not push her to. There did not seem to be much left to say that had not already been said in some form over the past 2 days. It was well past midnight when she finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she kept thinking about something Hale had told her once, weeks before the attack, during a long quiet stretch on a transport flight when there had been nothing else to occupy their time but conversation. He had told her that, where he came from, the idea of leaving someone behind was not simply frowned upon, it was considered a kind of failure that reflected on everyone involved, not just the person making the immediate decision. She said he had told her that story with a kind of quiet intensity that she had not fully understood at the time, but that she understood completely now, sitting in the dark on a hostile moon, 3 of their original unit already gone, waiting for whatever reckoning Daniel Hale had decided to bring to the rest of them. I asked her if she was afraid. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said she was, but not entirely of Hale himself. She said what frightened her most was the growing certainty that whatever confrontation was coming, none of us would be able to argue our way out of it, because everything Hale had done since the checkpoint suggested a person who was not driven by anger or madness, but by a cold, deliberate clarity about exactly what had happened and exactly what should follow from it. She said that kind of clarity was far more frightening than rage would have been, because rage could sometimes be reasoned with, could sometimes burn itself out given enough time. Clarity, she said, simply waited, patient and certain, for exactly the right moment to arrive. Somewhere out in the darkness beyond our narrow shelter, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint sound that might have been footsteps, or might have been nothing at all, and both of us fell silent, watching the dark, waiting for whatever came next. We broke camp before full light the next morning, none of us having slept more than an hour or 2 at a stretch, and Sergeant Holt pushed the pace harder than he had at any point since the checkpoint fell. I think he understood, the same way the rest of us understood, that whatever was coming would arrive on its own schedule, regardless of how quickly we moved, but movement itself had become a kind of ritual against fear, something to do with our bodies, while our minds circled the same unanswerable questions over and over. The terrain narrowed again as the morning wore on, the broken hills giving way to a deep ravine that our route required us to cross before rejoining the extraction corridor on the far side. Sergeant Holt studied the ravine carefully through his equipment before committing us to the descent, checking for any sign of instability in the rock walls or any indication of hostile presence waiting below. The scanner showed nothing, the same way it had shown nothing every time we had checked it since Marcus disappeared. I had stopped trusting that particular readout somewhere around the second night, and judging by the tight set of Sergeant Holt's jaw as he lowered the device, I suspected he had reached the same conclusion. We descended into the ravine in careful single file, the walls rising steep and close on either side, blocking out much of the morning light and leaving us moving through a corridor of deep shadow that made every sound carry strangely, bouncing off stone in ways that made it hard to judge distance or direction. It was near the bottom of the descent, where the ravine widened slightly into a small clearing before narrowing again toward the far side, that Sergeant Holt called a halt. He said something felt wrong. He could not articulate exactly what, beyond a trained instinct built over years of field experience, but he wanted us alert, weapons ready, moving through the clearing as quickly as possible, without breaking into a full run that might exhaust us before we reached the far side. We started across the clearing in tight formation, Nina and Grace flanking Sergeant Holt, while I brought up the rear, watching the ravine walls behind us for any sign of movement. That was when Daniel Hale finally stepped out of the shadows ahead of us, blocking the narrow path that led toward the far side of the ravine. I want to describe that moment carefully because it has stayed with me more vividly than almost anything else from those long days on Krathis 9, and I want to get it right. He did not look like a threat in the way I had braced myself to expect. He looked exhausted, his uniform torn and scorched in several places, one arm held carefully against his side in a way that suggested it was still healing from some injury sustained during his escape from the checkpoint. His face was gaunt, marked with cuts that had scarred over roughly, the kind of wounds that come from days spent surviving without proper medical care. But his eyes were steady, calm in a way that felt far more unsettling than anger would have been, exactly the way Grace had described during our conversation 2 nights before. Sergeant Holt raised his weapon immediately, and beside him, Nina and Grace did the same, the 3 of them forming a rough line facing Hale across the small clearing. I moved up behind them, my own weapon raised, though some part of me already understood that whatever was about to happen would not be resolved through force. Hale did not raise his hands, and he did not reach for any weapon of his own. He simply stood there, watching us with that same steady calm, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the clearing, quiet but perfectly measured. He said he was glad we had finally stopped running. Sergeant Holt demanded to know where Owen and Marcus were, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining command presence in the face of something none of his training had prepared him to handle. Hale answered without hesitation. He said both of them were alive and unharmed, being kept safe in a shelter he had established some distance from our current position, and he said he intended to reunite the entire unit before this was finished, provided the rest of us made the right choices in the time remaining. Grace asked him, her voice shaking slightly despite her obvious effort to control it, why he had taken them at all, why he had not simply approached us directly, if his intention had never been to cause harm. Hale was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, something in his tone shifted, the calm giving way slightly to something rawer underneath. He said that he had spent 3 days buried under debris after we left, listening to the sounds of the checkpoint's remaining defenses failing around him, uncertain whether the next collapse would finally finish what the first one had started. He said he had eventually freed himself, more through desperation than skill, and had spent the following hours moving through hostile terrain alone, wounded, with no support and no certainty that any help was coming. He said that during those hours, he had thought a great deal about what it meant to be left behind by people he had trusted, people he had trained beside, eaten beside, protected, and been protected by for 3 months. He said he had decided that if his own unit could not understand the weight of that choice through words alone, then perhaps they needed to understand it through experience instead. He said that was why he had taken Marcus and Owen quietly, without harm, holding them somewhere safe, while the rest of us were forced to feel, even briefly, the same uncertainty and fear he had felt in those long hours alone under the collapsed checkpoint. He said he wanted us to understand, completely, exactly what it felt like to not know whether someone you cared about was alive or dead, safe or lost, coming back or gone forever. Sergeant Holt's weapon lowered slightly as Hale spoke, though I do not think he was even aware of the movement himself. So completely was his attention fixed on the words unfolding in front of him. Nina finally lowered her own weapon entirely, her face crumpling with an emotion I had not seen from her since this ordeal began. She said she was sorry, her voice breaking on the word, and I understood that she meant it completely, that whatever fear had driven her through the past 3 days had finally given way to something closer to grief. Hale looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, though the steady calm underneath it did not fully disappear. He said he understood why we had made the choice we made. He said he had turned it over many times during those long hours alone, trying to see it from the perspective of a squad leader forced to weigh 5 lives against one under a wall that was actively failing above them. He said he did not entirely disagree with the logic, even now. But he said that understanding a choice and forgiving it were not the same thing, and that he needed us to understand exactly how deeply that choice had cut, not as an abstract lesson in tactics, but as something felt completely, in the body and in the heart, before he could decide what came next. Sergeant Holt lowered his weapon fully now, and I watched something in his posture change, the rigid command bearing he had maintained through 3 days of crisis, finally giving way to something closer to simple exhaustion and honesty. He said he was sorry too. He said the decision to leave Hale behind was one he had made in seconds, under pressure, with a collapsing structure above them, and limited time to weigh every possible alternative, but he said that did not make the weight of it any lighter now, standing here in this clearing 3 days later, looking at the man he had chosen to leave behind. He asked Hale what he wanted from us now. He asked it directly, without evasion, and I understood that whatever authority he still carried as squad leader, he was extending it to this moment as an offering rather than a demand. Hale considered the question for a long moment, his steady eyes moving across each of our faces in turn, lingering briefly on mine, before continuing on to Grace, then finally settling back on Sergeant Holt. He said what he wanted was simple, even if the path there had not been. He wanted the entire unit whole again. Every member accounted for, every debt of trust acknowledged rather than buried under silence and unspoken guilt. He said he was prepared to lead us to where Owen and Marcus were being kept, and he was prepared to walk with us toward the extraction corridor once we were reunited, but only if the unit was willing to complete one final task first. He said there were still 2 members of our original team unaccounted for, back at the ruins of the checkpoint we had abandoned 3 days earlier. Not human, not part of the exchange program that had brought him to our unit, but 2 coalition troopers who had been fighting alongside the rest of us when the checkpoint fell, and whose fate none of us had bothered to confirm before running. I felt something cold settle in my chest at those words, because he was right, and I had not even thought of it until this exact moment. In the chaos of the collapse, in the desperate scramble to escape, we had accounted for our immediate group and assumed the worst about anyone not directly in front of us. We had never gone back to check. We had never even discussed it. Hale said that if we were serious about understanding what it meant to leave no one behind, that understanding could not simply apply to him. It had to apply to everyone, including the 2 troopers we had left without a second thought, while focusing entirely on our own survival and our own guilt. He said the choice was ours to make. We could continue on toward the extraction corridor now, reunited only partially, carrying this same unresolved weight forward into whatever came next. Or we could turn back, together, and finish what should have been done 3 days ago, for everyone who had been left behind that day, not just for him. Sergeant Holt looked at each of us in turn, and I understood he was asking a question without words, checking whether the rest of the unit was prepared to follow him into whatever this decision would demand. Grace nodded first, her face set with a kind of determination I had not seen from her since before the checkpoint fell. Nina followed, wiping at her eyes but standing straighter than she had in days. I nodded too, and I meant it completely, because somewhere in the space of that single conversation, the fear that had driven us through 3 days of pursuit had finally begun to transform into something else entirely. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first genuine sense that there might be a path forward from this that did not simply end in more loss. Sergeant Holt turned back to Hale and said we would go, all of us, together, back to the checkpoint, to finish what we should have done from the very beginning. Hale studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression finally shifted fully away from the cold clarity he had carried since stepping out of the shadows, replaced by something closer to the quiet warmth I remembered from 3 months of shared meals and shared watches before the checkpoint ever fell. He said that was the right answer. He said it quietly, almost gently, and then he turned and began walking back the way he had come, gesturing for the rest of us to follow, toward wherever Owen and Marcus were waiting, and beyond that, back toward the ruins of the checkpoint and the reckoning that still remained to be finished. Hale led us through the ravine and up along a narrow game trail that climbed steadily out of the low ground, moving with a quiet confidence that made it clear he had spent the last 3 days learning every fold and hollow of this terrain far better than any of us had managed in our brief and frightened passage through it. Despite his obvious exhaustion and the injuries still marking his body, he moved with purpose, never hesitating at a fork in the trail, never pausing to check direction against any instrument. None of us spoke much during that first stretch of walking. There was too much settling in all of us at once, relief and shame and cautious hope tangled together in a way that made ordinary conversation feel almost impossible. I found myself watching Hale from behind as we walked, trying to reconcile the calm, deliberate figure leading us now with the quiet, gentle person I remembered from 3 months of shared duty before the checkpoint fell. It was Grace who finally found her voice first, moving up alongside Hale as the trail widened enough to walk 2 abreast. She asked him, quietly, how he had managed to survive the collapse at all, buried the way we had seen him buried under that failing support strut. Hale was silent for a moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried none of the cold clarity from the clearing, only a kind of tired honesty. He said the strut had not pinned him as completely as it appeared from where we stood. He said he had spent nearly an hour working his legs free, inch by inch, while the structure above him continued to groan and shift, uncertain with every movement whether the next one would bring the whole ceiling down on top of him. He said that once free, he had waited in the ruins for some time, listening to the sounds of the battle receding, before finally deciding that staying meant certain death and moving meant at least the possibility of survival. He said he had used what medical supplies remained in his kit to stabilize his injuries as best he could, and then he had simply started walking, following the same general direction he assumed the rest of us had taken. He said he had found Marcus first, quite by accident, resting near the edge of the forest after falling slightly behind our main group during that first difficult night. He said he had approached carefully, uncertain how Marcus would react to seeing him again, and had made the decision in that moment to observe rather than immediately reveal himself, wanting to understand how the unit was processing what had happened before deciding what to do next. Nina asked him quietly why he had not simply revealed himself immediately rather than choosing to follow us in silence for 2 full days, allowing our fear and uncertainty to build with every unexplained sound in the dark. Hale considered the question seriously before answering. He said that in the hours after freeing himself from the wreckage, alone and uncertain whether he would survive the night, something in him had shifted. He said he had always believed, in the abstract way a person believes something they have never actually tested, that he understood the weight of trust and loyalty within a unit. But he said that lying alone under that failing ceiling, listening to our footsteps fading away into the dark, had taught him something about that weight he had never fully understood before. He said he had wanted us to feel some small measure of that same uncertainty, that same fear of the unknown, before he was willing to step forward and offer any kind of resolution. He said he understood now, looking back on it, that this had perhaps been an unfair thing to ask of us, given everything else we were already carrying, but he said he did not regret the decision entirely, because he believed it had brought us to a place of understanding that words alone might never have reached. I found myself surprised by how easily I accepted that explanation, though perhaps surprise was the wrong word. Perhaps what I felt was simple recognition, the understanding that fear taught lessons that comfort rarely could, and that whatever anger I might have carried toward Hale for the last 3 days had already begun dissolving into something closer to respect. We reached the shelter where Owen and Marcus were being kept just before midday, a shallow cave system tucked into a fold of the hills that Hale had apparently discovered during his own days of solitary survival. Both of them emerged as we approached, and I felt something in my chest loosen at the sight of them, whole and unharmed, exactly as Hale had promised. Marcus looked thinner than when we had last seen him, his uniform torn in several places, but his eyes were clear, and his relief at seeing the rest of us was immediate and unguarded. Owen looked similarly worn but unharmed, and the moment he saw Grace, something passed between them that needed no words, a wordless acknowledgement of everything they had each endured over the past 3 days. There was a period of quiet reunion after that, embraces and murmured apologies, and the kind of relief that comes only after fear has finally released its grip. I watched Sergeant Holt approach Marcus directly, saying something quiet that I did not hear clearly, but I saw Marcus nod slowly in response, and I understood that whatever had passed between them carried the weight of genuine reconciliation, rather than simple relief. We rested for a short time at the shelter, sharing what remained of our supplies, allowing ourselves the first real meal in days that did not carry the constant tension of an unknown threat somewhere in the surrounding dark. Hale explained, during that pause, exactly what he had learned about the 2 coalition troopers we had left behind at the checkpoint, information he had gathered during his own cautious return to the ruins in the hours before finding Marcus in the forest. He said he had confirmed that both troopers, whose names I will not include here out of respect for details that belong properly to their own story, had survived the initial collapse, but remained trapped in a separate section of the ruins that had not been accessible to him alone, given his own injuries and limited equipment. He said he believed they were likely still alive, given the structural integrity of the section where they were trapped, but that time remained a critical factor, and further delay would only decrease the chances of a successful recovery. Sergeant Holt asked him directly why he had not attempted the recovery himself, given that he had clearly possessed the information and the location necessary to do so. Hale answered honestly, without any defensiveness in his tone. He said that freeing trapped troopers from a partially collapsed structure was not a task one person could accomplish alone, particularly not a person already wounded and operating with severely limited supplies. He said he had made the calculation, difficult as it was, that his time and energy were better spent locating and stabilizing the members of his own unit first, in the hope that a reunited group would have the collective strength necessary to complete a rescue that a single exhausted person could not manage alone. I understood, hearing that explanation, that Hale had faced his own version of the same brutal calculation that had led Sergeant Holt to leave him behind 3 days earlier. The circumstances were different, but the underlying arithmetic was uncomfortably similar, and I think all of us recognized that similarity in the quiet that followed his explanation. Sergeant Holt nodded slowly, accepting the answer without further challenge, and then he asked the question that mattered most now, given everything that had happened since. He asked how quickly we could reach the checkpoint ruins from our current position, and whether Hale believed the 2 trapped troopers still had time remaining before the situation became unrecoverable. Hale considered the question carefully, calculating distances and terrain difficulty in his head before answering. He said that moving quickly, without unnecessary delay, we could reach the ruins within several hours, arriving with enough daylight remaining to attempt a careful, coordinated recovery before nightfall made the work significantly more dangerous. Sergeant Holt did not hesitate. He gave the order to move immediately, and I watched something settle into his posture that had been missing since the checkpoint first fell, a return of purpose and clarity that came from finally having a task worth the full weight of the unit's remaining strength and attention. As we prepared to set out, Hale fell into step beside me for a moment, and I found myself surprised by the simple gesture, given everything that had passed between him and the rest of the unit over the previous 3 days. He asked me quietly how I was holding up, and something in the gentle familiarity of the question reminded me sharply of the person I had known before the checkpoint ever fell, the quiet, patient trooper who had learned 3 words of my language just to greet me properly each morning. I told him honestly that I did not fully know yet, that the last 3 days had asked more of me than I had been prepared to give, and that I suspected it would take considerable time to fully process everything that had happened between the collapse of the checkpoint and this moment now, walking together back toward the ruins we had once fled in fear and shame. He nodded slowly, accepting that honesty without judgment, and then he said something that stayed with me for the rest of that long walk back toward the checkpoint. He said that trust, once broken, could still be rebuilt, but only through action rather than words, only through the willingness to return and finish what fear had once caused a person to abandon. He said that was the entire purpose behind everything he had done over the past 3 days, difficult and frightening as it had been for all of us. Not punishment, not simple revenge, but a slow, deliberate path back toward the kind of trust that could only be earned through demonstrated commitment rather than apology alone. I told him I understood, and I meant it completely, and as we continued walking together back toward the checkpoint, back toward the 2 troopers still waiting somewhere in the ruins for a rescue that had almost never come, I felt something shift within the unit as a whole, a fragile but genuine sense that whatever came next, we would face it together, fully accounted for, with no one left behind again. The journey back toward the checkpoint felt entirely different from the frightened, fractured retreat that had carried us away from it 3 days earlier. We moved with purpose now, 7 of us instead of the scattered, guilt-stricken group that had fled into the trees, and even the terrain itself seemed less threatening in daylight, with a clear destination and a united unit rather than an unknown pursuer somewhere in the shadows. Hale led the way, navigating with the same quiet confidence he had shown since stepping out of the shadows in the ravine, occasionally pausing to check terrain features against his memory of the path he had traveled alone over the previous days. Sergeant Holt walked close behind him, and I noticed the two of them speaking quietly from time to time, low conversations that none of the rest of us tried to overhear, though I suspected they carried the weight of a command relationship being carefully, deliberately rebuilt. Marcus and Owen walked together near the middle of our formation, and I could see the way exhaustion and relief had settled into their features differently than the rest of us, marked by 3 days of captivity that had clearly tested them in ways the rest of us had only experienced through fear of the unknown. But there was no bitterness in either of their expressions, no visible resentment toward Hale for what he had put them through. If anything, I sensed something closer to understanding in how they carried themselves, as though the ordeal had clarified something for them that might have taken much longer to understand through words alone. We reached the outer perimeter of the checkpoint ruins as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, and the sight that greeted us was sobering in ways that none of us had fully prepared for. The structure we had once held for 11 hours against a determined assault was little more than a broken skeleton now, support beams jutting at unnatural angles, entire sections collapsed into rubble that stretched across what had once been a defensible position. Hale led us carefully through the debris field, pointing out sections that remained structurally unstable and should be avoided, clearly drawing on knowledge gathered during his earlier solitary return to these ruins. We moved slowly, methodically, checking each area he indicated before proceeding, understanding that careless movement here could easily trigger further collapse and turn a rescue mission into another tragedy entirely. It took nearly an hour of careful searching before we located the section where the 2 trapped troopers remained, a partially collapsed storage bunker on the checkpoint's eastern side that had somehow held its structural integrity despite the destruction surrounding it. We could hear faint sounds from within, movement and muffled voices that confirmed what Hale had believed, that both troopers remained alive, trapped but not beyond hope of rescue. The work that followed was slow and careful, every member of the unit contributing according to their particular strengths. Sergeant Holt directed the overall effort, drawing on his tactical training to assess the safest points to begin clearing debris. Marcus and Owen, despite their own exhaustion, threw themselves into the physical labor with a determination that spoke to something deeper than simple duty. Grace worked alongside them, her earlier fear transformed into focused, practical energy. Nina monitored the structural integrity of the surrounding debris with careful attention, calling out warnings whenever a shift in the rubble suggested instability. I found myself working alongside Hale for much of that effort, the two of us clearing a narrow channel through collapsed material that would eventually allow the trapped troopers a path to safety. Despite his injuries, he worked with a steady, controlled intensity, never rushing despite the urgency of the situation, understanding that careless haste here could easily undo everything we were trying to accomplish. It was nearly 2 hours before we finally cleared enough debris to reach the trapped troopers directly, and the moment their faces appeared through the gap we had created, exhausted but very much alive, I felt something release in my chest that I had been carrying since the moment the checkpoint first began to fall 3 days earlier. The final extraction took considerable additional care, moving the injured troopers carefully through the narrow channel we had created, stabilizing them as best we could with the limited medical supplies remaining across the unit. But within another hour, both were free, resting safely in the open air beyond the ruins, their gratitude evident in every exhausted word they managed to speak. Sergeant Holt knelt beside them as they rested, offering quiet reassurance, and I watched something in his posture that I had not seen since before the checkpoint fell. A return of the steady, grounded leadership that had defined him before 3 days of guilt and fear had worn it down to something more fragile. Hale stood apart from the immediate reunion, watching with an expression I found difficult to fully read, something between quiet satisfaction and lingering exhaustion. I moved to stand beside him, and for a while neither of us spoke, simply watching the rest of the unit tend to the 2 troopers we had finally, completely brought home. Eventually he spoke, his voice quiet, almost reflective. He said that this was what he had wanted from the very beginning, though he acknowledged that the path he had chosen to reach this moment had asked a great deal from all of us, more perhaps than he had fully considered when he first made the decision to follow, rather than immediately reveal himself. I told him I understood, and that whatever discomfort the past 3 days had caused, I believed we had arrived at something worth the difficulty. I told him that the unit standing here now, fully accounted for, felt fundamentally different from the fractured, guilt-ridden group that had fled these same ruins 3 days earlier, and that difference felt like something worth carrying forward. He nodded slowly, and something in his expression softened further, the last traces of that cold, deliberate clarity finally giving way entirely to something closer to simple relief. We made camp that evening within sight of the checkpoint ruins, the entire unit together for the first time since before the attack began, sharing what remained of our combined supplies and taking turns describing, in fragments, everything each of us had experienced over the previous 3 days. It was not an easy conversation, filled as it was with admissions of fear and guilt and uncertainty, but there was something healing in the simple act of speaking it all out loud, together, rather than carrying it alone in silence. Sergeant Holt called for extraction contact once we had re-established communication range, and confirmation came back within the hour that a recovery transport would reach our position by morning. That night, for the first time since the checkpoint fell, I slept soundly, without the constant listening dread that had haunted every previous night of our journey. The transport arrived as promised the next morning, and as we boarded together, all 9 members of our unit accounted for and alive, I found myself thinking about everything that had unfolded since that first desperate retreat through the trees of the Calvo Reach. I thought about the fear that had driven us through those long nights, the guilt that had shaped every step of our journey, and the strange, difficult path that had ultimately led us back to wholeness rather than further loss. News of what had happened at Krathis 9 traveled through coalition channels faster than any of us expected, and in the weeks that followed our recovery, I learned that our situation had drawn attention well beyond our own chain of command. Officers from several different divisions requested detailed accounts of the incident, and I later heard, through channels that filtered slowly down to trooper level, that the events on Krathis 9 had prompted a quiet but significant revision to how multi-species units were briefed regarding human personnel. The new guidance was not widely publicized, but those of us who had lived through it understood its origin clearly enough. It emphasized, in careful institutional language, that human commitment to the principle of leaving no one behind should not be treated as sentiment or exaggeration, but as an operational reality that shaped how human personnel processed trust, loyalty, and the aftermath of difficult tactical decisions made under pressure. I think about Daniel Hale often, even now, years removed from those long, frightening days on Krathis 9. I think about the calm, deliberate way he pursued us through the dark, not out of cruelty, but out of a conviction so deep it reshaped how an entire unit understood the weight of the choices we made under pressure. I think about the moment he stepped out of the shadows in that narrow ravine, exhausted and wounded but unbroken, and offered us not punishment, but the chance to finish what fear had once caused us to abandon. The galaxy speaks of humanity's arrival among the stars in many different ways, some fearful, some cautious, some deeply respectful. I understand now, in a way I could not have understood before those 3 days in the Calvo Reach, exactly why that respect runs as deep as it does among those who have served alongside them. It is not simply their strength, or their technology, or their determination in open conflict that earns that respect. It is the quiet, unbending promise carried by soldiers like Daniel Hale, who will not let go of the ones who fought beside them, even when the rest of the galaxy might understand, might forgive, might quietly move on. Humans remember, and more than that, they return, patient and certain, until every promise made in the chaos of battle is finally, completely, kept.